half.
Hello and welcome to the History Extra podcast from BBC History Magazine, Britain's best-selling history magazine. I'm Ellie Cawthorne. For today's episode, I spoke to the historian and author Nicola Tallis. Nicola's latest book, Uncrowned Queen, is a biography of the formidable 15th century noblewoman Margaret Beaufort. Nicola joined me in our offices in Bristol to discuss how Margaret managed to survive the Wars of the Roses and secure the throne for her son, Henry VII. For listeners who might not know anything about Margaret Beaufort, who's the subject of your new biography, could you start by introducing us to her and her extraordinary life?
Yeah, of course. So I think the key things with Margaret to note are that she was a woman who had the most extraordinary character, and in an age when women were expected to be obedient and subservient to men and their husbands, Margaret really broke those rules and managed to assert herself and make her voice heard in this male-dominated world. And I suppose today she's best remembered as the mother of the Tudor dynasty, being the mother of Henry VII. And that in itself is a really extraordinary story because she was pregnant at the age of 12 and gave birth to Henry, who was to be her only child, at the age of 13. So I think that in itself is probably the most extraordinary episode of her life and one that we really remember her for today.
What kind of sources are we looking at to find out something about Margaret's personality and, as you say, her strong character?
Do you know, we're actually really, really fortunate that we have got quite a lot of source material for various areas of Margaret's life, particularly for her later years, when we've got a relatively complete set of her household accounts. And these give us an insight into the way that she was spending her money. I mean, she'd always been a very wealthy woman, but by the time these accounts come into existence, she was the king's mother and she had an extraordinary level of wealth. And they do really offer us these fascinating glimpses into her personality. So, for example, we can see that she had two fools. One was called Skip, and she often paid for his clothes and for them to be washed. He wore high-heeled shoes, and she had another fool later in life whose name was Reginald the Idiot. So she was a woman who really liked to be entertained. She really enjoyed hunting. She enjoyed hawking. She loved gambling. And she was also really fond of the finer things in life. So we see, again, payments in her accounts for wine, white wine. She was also really, really quite fond of clothes and jewels as well. So there are lots of payments in her accounts to goldsmiths for various items. So she really was a woman who liked the finer things in life.
Margaret's early life, which she managed to cram a lot into, was dominated by the Wars of the Roses. She was living in a very, very turbulent time. How did that backdrop of turbulence in England affect her upbringing?
I mean, it directly impacted her life right from the start, really. Her father had died just a couple of days before her first birthday, not as a result of the Wars of the Roses, it probably, sadly, at his own hand. But it left Margaret very vulnerable, and from the start of her life, she was always sort of the victim of men and power politics, and she did become very directly involved in the Wars of the Roses because it was as a result of the death of her second husband, Edmund Tudor, Henry VII's father, and the onset of the Wars of the Roses, that Margaret then felt obliged to remarry. Rather extraordinarily, given that she was 13 at this time, she played a very large hand in arranging her third marriage and choosing her third husband. But then when Edward IV succeeded to the throne, she did her very best to try and ingratiate herself with the king. I think primarily her motivation was in order to try and keep her son safe. That was always at the forefront of her mind. And it was at her urging that following the Lancastrian defeat at the Battle of Tewkesbury in 1471, that Henry Tudor, who was then 14, fled abroad and didn't come home again until 1485 when he won the Battle of Bosworth. Until that point, Margaret really sort of tried to keep her head down and ingratiate herself with Edward IV and the Yorkists. But as soon as Edward IV dies unexpectedly in April 1483, and the whole mysterious happenings of Edward V being usurped by Richard III occur, Margaret seems to take she takes a more active and very different stance on things. And it's at that point that she suddenly perceives an opportunity for her son to become King of England. And prior to 1483, the idea of Henry Tudor becoming King of England would have been completely absurd. Nobody would ever have considered him. But it's as a direct result of the disappearance of the princes in the Tower and Richard III's usurpation that Margaret then takes a more direct role in the Wars of the Roses and plots against Richard III.
We'll come back to plots against Richard III in a minute, but from what you're saying there, she took a very active role in shaping the course of her own life.
Yeah, very much so. To begin with, she started life by playing by the rules, I think it's fair to say. And then, I think as soon as her son's born, it really changes her whole outlook. And suddenly it's not just herself that she has to consider. She has this other life and one that's infinitely more precious to her. And I think that really, that was a real driving force for Margaret when it came to shaping her own life and her own destiny. And she was determined at that point to avoid a husband not of her own choosing being thrust upon her. And so takes matters into her own hands. And I think really from that point onwards, from the age of 13 onwards, that's when she really sort of takes control of her own destiny.
When you say from the age of 13 onwards, it is incredible. By 13, she was entering into a third marriage. She'd been widowed and had a child.
I think it really made her a stronger character. She'd had a very devastating start in life, like I say, with her father, who she'd never known, possibly dying at his own hand, and similarly, when her second husband Edmund Tudor died, these two male protectors from her life have gone. Equally, she had a guardian before that, the Duke of Suffolk, who was murdered. So I think from that point onwards, she realises that men can be unreliable. And it really sort of gives her the opportunity to make her own, to bring out her own character and to make her own decisions in life.
Margaret gave birth to Henry at a very young age, and she never had any of the children, despite marrying 2 more times after his father had died. How unusual would that have been at the time?
I mean, I tried to do quite a lot of research into the physical side to work out if there were any physical reasons why she couldn't have given birth to more children. And there are physical possibilities, but I think 500 years on, it's dangerous to make those sorts of claims. And I do wonder if it was a conscious choice of Margaret's not to become pregnant again and not to give birth to any more children. And, there are several reasons why I say that. I think it's very clear that Henry's birth left her emotionally traumatized. We know it was a very difficult birth, and it certainly left her with emotional scars. As you can imagine, you become pregnant at 12 and, she was very physically slight. So, we can only imagine how difficult that whole process must have been for her. But I think also, so later in life, there was one of her books where she'd highlighted a passage that talked about frigidity and talked about, was it a sin to loathe sex? And I feel like that's quite telling in Margaret. And the fact that all of her husbands, or most of her husbands, are chosen primarily for the political advantage that they can offer her rather than for any personal reasons. So as far as we know, Margaret never married for love, even though her third marriage to Henry Stafford was quite happy, I think. But I do wonder if it was perhaps a conscious choice that she made not to have more children. But it's only speculative.
Something I found very interesting in the book is that Margaret's allegiances didn't always necessarily marry up with those of her husband. She was born into a Lancastrian family, but she later became very important in the Yorkist court, before then again leading rebellions against Richard III and the Yorkists. Do you think she was motivated by family loyalty, or was she just a canny political manoeuvrer who was looking for her next opportunity?
I think a bit of both. I think she was very pragmatic, and she'd learnt pragmatism from a very, very early age from the experiences of all these men that she'd had in her life, her husbands and so on. I think ultimately she was always very loyal to her own house, the House of Lancaster. But I think that she was astute enough to know when a battle or a cause was lost, at least temporarily. And I think that's very much what we see with Margaret, is that when Edward IV becomes king in 1461, I think at that time Margaret realises that she really has no choice at that time but to submit herself to the House of York. And we see that with her husband at that time, Henry Stafford, who'd always also been a Lancastrian, that they both kind of try their best to try and ingratiate themselves with this Yorkist king and this Yorkist regime. And I think, that was a policy that Margaret employed throughout the reign of Edward IV. And, we know that she was trying to negotiate with Edward IV for the return home of her son Henry, and that he actually signed a draft pardon for Henry's return. But sadly, it's like an episode from a soap. Edward then dies before the pardon can be implemented. And then there's all this uncertainty with Richard III. And I think at that point, Margaret sort of threw caution to the wind. And, for all this time, she'd sort of lain low and tried to keep on Edward IV's in his good books. And at that point, she sort of decides that she's going to risk it all. And unfortunately for her, at that time, it all goes badly wrong.
What do you think was key to her survival through all these regime changes?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question. I mean, with Richard III, I think she was just very fortunate that the king couldn't afford to lose the support of her then fourth husband, Thomas Stanley. But prior to that, I think she hadn't really done anything out of the ordinary that placed her in danger. But her actions during Richard III's reign were very different. And I do think it was solely down to the fact that Richard III needed her husband, Lord Stanley's support, that was the only reason that Margaret kept her head. I think otherwise she would certainly have been executed.
Can you tell us a bit more about her involvement in a plot against Richard III?
Yeah, so it's very likely that almost from the start of Richard III's reign, Margaret had begun plotting against him. And we know that by October 1483, so just a few months after Richard's usurpation, Margaret had become involved in the rebellion popularly known as the Buckingham Rebellion, which was led by the Duke of Buckingham, who was also one of Margaret's kinsmen. He was her cousin and nephew by marriage. And the whole point of this was to overthrow Richard and, at least in Margaret's eyes, replace Richard with her son, Henry Tudor. And we know that she was very busy working on her son's behalf, sending her messengers abroad to keep Henry informed of what was going on in England. But unfortunately, the plot was a dismal failure, and the Duke of Buckingham was executed. Henry Tudor, who'd sailed to England, swiftly turned back around and headed back to Brittany. And Margaret herself, she was so fortunate because, as I said, she could quite easily have met a traitor's death. But instead, in some ways, I think that the punishment was worse for her because she had all of her lands taken away from her, and all of her life, she was very involved with the running of her lands, and later in life we see this as well. So I think for her that would have been a very bitter pill to swallow, and she was placed under house imprisonment with her husband as her custodian, forbidden to write to her son, forbidden to have any contact with him. So yeah, it could have been a lot worse for her. She could have been killed, but I think for her, she would have seen the consequences as being pretty dire anyway.
What was it that turned her against Richard? Why was she happy to negotiate with and ingratiate herself to Edward, but couldn't quite tolerate it with Richard?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good question, and one that we don't quite know the answer for sure. I think my personal opinion is that she probably thought that her son would have been assured of a better future under, when Edward IV dies, under Edward V, Edward's son. I'm not sure if Richard had perhaps, left her with little reason to hope that her son Henry might be able to return home. We don't really know for sure, but I think really she was right on the verge of managing to achieve the return home of her son, who she'd not seen for that time for more than a decade, and she hadn't really spent very much time with him at all whilst he was growing up. So I think the fact that suddenly his future was up in the air, everything was up in the air really when Richard III came to the throne. I think Margaret just took a gamble and unfortunately didn't pay off at that time.
Still to come on the History Extra podcast.
And that everything that she did right until the end of her life was motivated by her family and her love and devotion to them.
She was clearly quite a skilled negotiator. What were some of the ways in which a woman, a noble woman such as Margaret, could exercise power at the time?
There weren't very many, actually, because they were sort of expected to be quiet and content themselves with their domestic duties. But I think actually Margaret is quite different because she, even during the days of her third marriage to Henry Stafford during the 1460s, we see that she was always travelling with her husband and and accompanying him to London when he went to visit Parliament, or travelling around and visiting her lands with Henry Stafford in tow, and later again with her fourth husband Thomas Stanley. She was trying her best to advise and support him, and helping with the running and administration of his lands as well. So I think that was something that women could do, was to oversee everything that was sort of considered to be in the domestic sphere, whilst taking a back seat when it came to matters of politics and things. And I think, up until a certain point, that was something that Margaret was relatively content to do.
Later on, of course, she negotiated a marriage between Henry, her son, and Elizabeth of York, who was the daughter of Elizabeth Woodville.
Yeah.
Could you tell us a bit about the relationship between Margaret and Elizabeth Woodville?
Yeah, sure. So I think it's really difficult to get a true understanding of what the relationship between them was, because I think that there's no doubt that Margaret probably would have been surprised as the rest of the country when Edward IV announced in 1464 that he had married Elizabeth Woodville secretly. And, she was the first commoner to become a Queen of England. Margaret was someone who was always very conscious of her noble background and her drops of royal blood. So I do wonder how she would have felt about the fact that she was suddenly having to bend her knee before this commoner Queen of England. But certainly if there was any friction between them during Edward IV's reign, then she didn't let it show, because we know that she did, as the 1470s drew on, Margaret was playing an increasingly prominent role at the Yorkist court, and she would have been in Elizabeth Woodville's presence fairly frequently. So we know that, for example, when Elizabeth gives birth to her last child in 1480, Princess Bridget, Margaret was the one who carried the princess to the font at her christening. And so that sort of indicates to me that by that time, Elizabeth Woodville probably, had come to trust her. And then, of course, during the reign of Richard III, that's when, as you say, they began plotting this marriage together for their children. And I think by that time, Margaret in some way sort of took advantage of the fact that Elizabeth was in quite a perilous situation, having gone from being, Queen of England to suddenly she's living in penury in sanctuary in Westminster Abbey. And I think Margaret, probably played on that quite a bit. And so they have this plan in place. Of course, that all goes wrong when the Buckingham Rebellion fails. And after that, Elizabeth Woodville comes to terms with Richard III. And I can't help but think that Margaret would have felt quite bitter about that, about her abandonment of her son. And I do also wonder if then when Henry VII came to the throne, 2 years after that, Elizabeth is basically banished from court and goes to live at Bermondsey. And, it's quite mysterious how that all comes about. But I do wonder how big a role Margaret played in that, because I think at that point she had established herself as the leading lady in the land, and she certainly wasn't going to be overlooked by Elizabeth Woodville. So I don't get the impression that they were great friends. I think they worked together when they had to. But I think for Margaret, it was a relationship that was born out of perhaps necessity rather than any genuine warmth of feeling.
But they were both two women playing very important political roles in court at the time, which is something I think maybe a lot of people don't necessarily associate with this period.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think, I think the 15th century in general is a really, really extraordinary and unique period for women because we see so many, ups and downs with, 1 minute Margaret of Anjou is queen and then Elizabeth Woodville's queen. And then it's back to Margaret of Anjou. And anyway, there were all these sort of power politics going on. And for the first time, women have been given the opportunity to make their voices heard and to play a role in politics in a way that they never have done before. And so it really is sort of unique for its turbulence and for the way that women were able to assert authority.
Some people have thrown out the theory that Margaret may have been involved in some dark way in the disappearance of Elizabeth Woodville's two sons, the Princes of the Tower. What's your opinion on that?
I just don't think there's a case to answer to. I just think it's absurd.
Why do you think people are so keen to cook up these theories, which may seem very outlandish from the source material?
I don't know. I think it's one of those mysteries that has just captured popular imagination, and revisionists and people who choose to believe that Richard III wasn't responsible. I think it's just one of those theories that people are casting around for, well, who else could it be? Of course, it could be Margaret Beaufort. But, that it is really, really important to say that not one contemporary source links Margaret with their disappearance. And to me, that is the most convincing argument that she wasn't involved.
After her son Henry defeated Richard at Bosworth and then took the throne, Margaret found herself as the mother of the king. How much power did she have in this position?
So this is really where the title of my book comes from, Uncrowned Queen, because I feel like that just says it all. I think that as soon as Henry VII becomes king, that's Margaret's position completely transformed, and she is able to wield power on an unprecedented scale. And Henry allows her to do that, which I think, again, that's a real testament to the strength of their relationship, which is really quite remarkable considering that they haven't spent that much time together. But yes, she really did become the most powerful woman in the realm and basically a queen in all but name. She was certainly a lot more powerful than Henry's wife, Elizabeth of York.
And what form did that power take?
At the beginning of Henry's reign, she was almost a constant presence by her son's side for probably the first 10 years or so, probably a bit more than that. And, you know, she was always quite often listed as though she and the Queen were the same person. Their names were always next to each other. She was reported to walk just half a pace behind the Queen. And so she was very, very visible at the forefront of the royal family. And
bit of an overbearing mother-in-law.
Yeah, you could say that. And yeah, so she's always there at court ceremonial, and her name is always listed amongst the royal family, which sort of gives an indication that contemporaries really viewed her as being powerful. And then from 1499 onwards, she moved away from London to Northamptonshire, to Collie Weston, which she developed into a huge, very grand palace. And it was here that she basically became the king's unofficial lieutenant in the Midlands and began administering justice in the king's name. So we know, for example, that she would hear cases. For example, there was one instance where she was trying people, if you like, for who'd been slandering the king in a Colchester tavern. And, you know, people would come to her with their lawsuits and their problems, and she would pass judgment in the king's name and deliver justice. She did wield a huge deal of power. And I think that she absolutely loved it.
And how unusual was that at the time?
It's completely unprecedented. And in doing so, she carved out a completely new role for herself within the Tudor regime. And I think what's really interesting as well is that lots of people don't recognise that when sadly her son died in April 1509, and his heir, Henry VIII, was just a few weeks short of his 18th birthday, it's left to Margaret to sort of oversee the smooth running of things. And she then basically acts as Henry VIII's unofficial regent for a few weeks in the lead up to his 18th birthday, and really sort of takes control of the situation and helps with all the arrangements for Henry's coronation, oversees Henry VII's funeral arrangements. So again, she's really wielding power all the way through Henry VII's reign, right through to the start of Henry VIII's reign.
Even after her son was king, she was married still to Stanley, but she led a very seemingly independent life. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So again, this is just something else that's completely unprecedented, because as soon as Henry VII becomes king, she becomes a femme sole, or basically an independent woman. And this is passed through Parliament. So it gives her complete independence financially. She's, all of her lands are her own and can't be touched by Stanley. She's basically got, every sort of independence going. She separates from him completely, although they still remain on really good terms. But Margaret later then takes a vow of chastity as well, with Stanley's approval. She basically, it's almost like she's waited for the moment when Henry becomes king to suddenly turn around and say, okay, this is what I've been waiting for. Now I can do my own thing. Now I'm my own woman, and there's no one that's going to stop me. And it's at that point, I think, that, they do still retain an amicable relationship. But from that point on, I think she realised she didn't need a husband because she had all the power she needed by herself.
I wonder how that then reflected on Stanley.
We know that they continued to work together, and they continued to visit one another. There was one occasion when they hosted a joint visit for the King and Queen at one of Stanley's northern estates. So there's no indication as to outwardly how he felt about it. But, I don't know, who knows? Maybe he found it a little bit humiliating, but we don't know.
I think over the course of this discussion, when we start with Henry VI, and as you say, we finish with Henry VIII, Margaret's life covered a really extraordinary era and a massive range of events. What do you think was some of the real defining moments for her particularly?
I think there are so many. I think, like I said, I think the fact that she grew up without a father, and that Edmund Tudor died just a couple of months before her son was born, really intensified her love for Henry when he was born. I think that is probably the defining moment of her life when Henry's born. And like I say, the fact that she lacked a male father figure, and sadly her son lacked the same in that sense. I think that was a real, that really intensified her need to protect him. And that was really the dominant sort of force in her life and shaped all of her actions and what she did from that point. I think when Henry VII became king, that really almost officially gave her the opportunity to legitimately voice her opinions and her power. And it did also give her the opportunity to kind of carve out her own identity and shape her own identity further, which she does because, everyone referred to her as the King's mother, my lady, the King's mother. And that's sort of a very definitive role. And, also after 1499, she began signing herself Margaret R. Been lots of debate over whether the R was for Richmond or whether the R was for Regina. Personally, I think it was for Regina. I think that she did very much associate herself with royalty, and again, that created other opportunities for her to think about defining moments. And I think it's then also that she starts thinking about what her legacy is going to be in the long run, and that's when she starts thinking about establishing colleges. So, she established 2 Cambridge colleges, Christ's and St John's. St John's wasn't established till after she died. But I think, Henry VII's reign, Henry VII's reign gives her the opportunity to start thinking about, well, okay, now I've got this power, how am I going to be remembered afterwards? And I think that's a real moment for her because, those colleges are still there today. And so Margaret is built into the very fabric of England.
You mentioned before the interview to me that you've sent the book to the printers today. You've brought together everything that there is to know about Margaret. What kind of person emerges? When you finish the book, what woman do you find?
I find a woman who I have got a great deal of admiration and empathy for, actually. I think she has been, unfortunately, she's had a bad rep in some quarters. And personally, I do feel like a lot of it's unjustified. There's no doubt that she could be very politically ruthless. She could be grasping on occasion. But ultimately, I feel like this is a woman who, from the start of her life, is driven by her love for her son. And I feel like that is the dominant force in her character throughout her whole life, and that everything that she did right until the end of her life was motivated by her family and her love and devotion to them. So I think that she's a very warm person. She's extremely generous, but also someone who wasn't afraid to make her voice heard and to pursue something that she saw as her right.
That was Nicola Tallis. Nicola's book, Uncrowned Queen, The Fateful Life of Margaret Beaufort, Tudor Matriarch, is out now, published by Michael O'Mara. You can read a version of my interview with Nicola in the December issue of BBC History magazine, which is also on sale now. Thanks for listening. Today's podcast was produced by Ben Hewitt and Jack Bateman. In our next episode, out on Monday, Thomas Harding tells the story of the family behind the iconic Lyons Empire, once one of the most famous names in British food.